Rejected at auction, dog is saved by young man. But no one imagined what would come next. Covered in scars and with an empty gaze, he seemed like just another animal broken by the system. But behind that silence was a buried past, a truth that many wanted to hide. What began as a rescue turned into a national exposé, and the story touched the country like an open wound. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. We continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll hear in your life. The yellowish light of the warehouse created dancing shadows on the concrete walls. The air, heavy with dust and human sweat, mixed with the smell of old leather and rusty metal. It was the last auction of the season in Pine Ridge, and the crowd gathered around the last available items. Old tractors, farm tools, furniture worn by time. Everything had found new owners throughout the night. The auctioneer, a man with a hoarse voice and theatrical gestures, wiped the sweat from his forehead as he prepared for the last item on the list. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached the end of our evening," he announced, adjusting his glasses on his nose. "Here we have our final lot, a military dog, German Shepherd, approximately 8 years old, comes with basic health documentation and partial service history." A murmur ran through the crowd. People approached the metal cage in the corner of the warehouse, where a motionless figure remained huddled. The animal was robust, with dark fur with golden patches, but his body seemed diminished by his defensive posture. His ears remained pinned to his head, and his eyes, which should have shone with the typical intelligence of the breed, looked like opaque glass. "Look at this animal," commented a farmer, shaking his head. "Looks like he's been through hard times. Look at these scars on his muzzle and back leg." Indeed, the dog showed evident marks of old injuries. An irregular scar ran from his left ear to near his eye. His right hind leg had discolored fur, indicating an injury that had been treated but left visible sequelae. What stood out most, however, was his behavior. While other auctioned animals had shown some curiosity or nervousness around people, this one remained completely static, as if disconnected from the world around him. "We'll start the bidding at $500, said the auctioneer, but his voice no longer carried the enthusiasm of the night. $500 for a militarily trained dog. Anyone bid 500? The silence extended for long seconds. A woman approached the cage and extended her hand toward the animal. He didn't react, not even when she snapped her fingers near the bars. It was as if he didn't see her. "That one's broken," said a man in a straw hat. "Traumatized military dog ain't good for nothing, just causes problems." $300, tried the auctioneer, but the disinterest was palpable. $300 for a purebred German Shepherd? At the back of the warehouse, leaning against a pile of old wood, a man watched in silence. Michael Reynolds was 42, with prematurely gray hair and a posture that betrayed years of military discipline. His green eyes, marked by expression lines, studied the animal with growing interest. There was something in that empty gaze that was familiar to him, a darkness he knew well, that had accompanied him since he returned from his last mission abroad. Michael approached the cage slowly. The dog didn't raise his head, but his ears moved almost imperceptibly toward the sound of footsteps. It was a subtle reaction, but for someone with military experience, significant. $200, said the auctioneer, his voice laden with resignation. $200, and we move on. Otherwise, well, you know what happens to animals nobody wants. The implicit threat made Michael clench his fists. He knew the fate of military dogs considered unfit for adoption. He knew that often the word disposal was used as a euphemism for procedures they preferred not to think about. His own experiences with institutional abandonment were still open wounds in his memory. "I'll take him," said Michael, raising his hand. The auctioneer seemed surprised. $200 for the final lot. Anyone give more than 200? "Friend, are you sure about this?" asked a nearby man. "This animal seems to be out of it. Could be dangerous." Michael didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed on the dog, who finally raised his head. For a brief moment, their gazes met. There was no recognition, no immediate connection, but there was something there. A shared pain, a tacit understanding that both carried invisible weights. $200 once, announced the auctioneer. $200 twice. Sold to the gentleman in the back. As Michael went to settle the paperwork, the dog lowered his head again, but this time one of his ears remained slightly raised, as if part of his consciousness had awakened just enough to register that something had changed. The bureaucratic process was quick. Michael received a folder with basic medical documents and a partially censored military report. The animal's name was registered as Sergeant, but there was no information about his specific missions or the circumstances that led him to that auction. Just official stamps, dates, and codes that didn't mean much to a civilian. He was in a rehabilitation center for military animals, explained the employee responsible for the documentation, but the program was discontinued. Budget cuts, you know how it is. Animals that couldn't be reintegrated into active service ended up being directed to civilian adoption. Michael nodded, but his suspicions deepened. He knew well how budget cuts worked in the armed forces. Often they were ways to cover up bigger problems or end programs that had become inconvenient. When the time came to transport the dog, Michael approached the cage carefully. Sergeant showed no aggression, but he didn't make the process easier either. He remained motionless as the collar was put on, as if disconnected from his own body. His movements were mechanical, devoid of the naturalness one would expect from a healthy animal. The journey to Michael's property, a small ranch on the outskirts of town, was made in silence. Sergeant remained huddled in the back seat of the pickup truck, trembling slightly at each sharp turn. Michael adjusted the rearview mirror to observe him and noticed that the dog didn't look out the window, showed no curiosity about the passing environment. His eyes remained fixed on an undefined point on the seat, as if trapped in memories he couldn't process. Michael's property was modest but well maintained. A simple two-bedroom house, a large yard surrounded by eucalyptus trees, and a small garden that he maintained more for therapy than necessity. It was a quiet place, away from the city's movement, chosen precisely because it offered the isolation he needed to deal with his own ghosts. When he got out of the truck, Michael left the back door open and moved a few meters away. Sergeant remained motionless for long minutes, as if assessing whether it was safe to get out. Finally, he slowly descended, keeping his body low and his ears pinned to his head. His movements were cautious, calculated, as if expecting an ambush at any moment. Michael led him to a corner of the yard where he had prepared a wooden doghouse and bowls with water and food. Sergeant sniffed the food but didn't touch it. He drank a little water and huddled at the entrance of the house from where he could observe both the house and the property's entrance gates. "It's okay, buddy," said Michael, keeping his distance. "You don't need to trust me right now, just make yourself at home." The first hours were mutual observation. Michael attended to his routine tasks, watering the garden, organizing tools, preparing his own meal, while keeping the dog in his peripheral vision. Sergeant didn't move from his chosen position, but his eyes followed every movement, every sound. It was evident that, despite his apparent apathy, his tactical awareness remained active. As day turned to night, Michael realized that they shared more than he had initially imagined. Like Sergeant, he also instinctively positioned himself to have visual control of the property's access points. Like the dog, he also startled at unexpected noises, a branch breaking, a car passing on the distant road. When it became completely dark, Michael lit some exterior lights and sat on the house's porch. Sergeant remained in his position, but now seemed more relaxed. His ears were no longer pinned to his head, and his breathing had become more regular. "Do you know what it's like not to be able to sleep properly?" asked Michael in a low voice, more to himself than to the dog. "Do you know what it's like to wake up in the middle of the night thinking you're still somewhere you shouldn't be?" Sergeant raised his head for the first time since arriving at the property. His eyes met Michael's, and for a brief moment there seemed to be mutual recognition, not of identity but of shared experience. The night deepened, and both remained in their positions, maintaining a silent vigilance that neither could completely explain. It was as if they were on guard, protecting something they didn't yet know exactly what it was. Perhaps it was the first night in a long time that neither felt completely alone with their own fears. The first days were marked by tension-filled silence. Michael established a careful routine, maintaining respectful distance while ensuring Sergeant had access to food, water, and a safe space. The dog continued to refuse most of the food, consuming only the minimum necessary to survive. His eyes remained alert but empty, as if they were programmed to detect threats without processing emotions. On the second morning, Michael found Sergeant in exactly the same position as the previous night. The dog hadn't slept in the house prepared for him, preferring to remain at the entrance, where he maintained a strategic view of the entire yard. His posture was that of a sentinel on perpetual duty, unable to relax even in safety. "You don't trust enclosed spaces," murmured Michael, recognizing the pattern. He himself had spent months sleeping only in armchairs, unable to lie in a bed that would leave him vulnerable. During the third night, a storm formed over the region. Michael was in his kitchen preparing coffee when the first thunders echoed across the property. The sound made his hands tremble involuntarily, spilling hot coffee on the counter. These were reflexes he had learned to control, but which still emerged in moments of surprise. Outside, Sargent had disappeared. Michael put on his boots and went out in the rain, carrying a flashlight. The storm intensified and the thunder became more frequent and deafening. He knew the effect that sudden and loud noises could have on a traumatized mind. He had witnessed colleagues entering total panic during storms, reliving moments of bombings and confrontations. "Sergeant!" he shouted, but his voice was lost in the wind. "Sergeant, where are you?" He followed paw prints in the mud which led him through the yard, past the eucalyptus trees, until they reached a fence that delimited his property. There were tracks on the other side, indicating that the dog had jumped the nearly 6-foot-high fence. Michael climbed it with difficulty, cutting his palm on the barbed wire. The rain had turned the terrain into a muddy field. Michael followed the footprints for almost an hour, crossing abandoned pastures and a small wooded area. His own traumas began to emerge as he walked in the darkness. Memories of nights in hostile territory, of lost companions, of missions that ended in tragedy. Finally, the flashlight illuminated a huddled figure under a group of trees. Sargent was pressed against the trunk of a kapok tree, trembling violently. His eyes were wide open, fixed on something only he could see. He was completely soaked, with mud covering his paws and belly. Michael approached slowly, speaking in a low voice. "Hey buddy, it's all right, it's just a storm." Sargent didn't react to his presence. His front paws scratched the ground repetitively, as if trying to dig a hole to hide. His breathing was irregular, panting, and small whimpers escaped from his throat. "I know," said Michael, sitting in the mud a few meters away. "I know how it is. The noises bring things back, don't they? Things you'd rather forget." The rain continued falling on both of them. Michael felt the cold water penetrating his clothes, but he didn't move. He knew that any sudden movement could worsen the dog's state. Instead, he began to speak, his voice competing with the noise of the storm. "I don't sleep well either," he confessed. "I wake up in the middle of the night thinking I'm still somewhere far from here. Places where you can't lower your guard for even a second." Sargent stopped scratching the ground. His head moved slightly in Michael's direction, but his eyes remained fixed on the emptiness. "You served somewhere hot, didn't you?" continued Michael. "Desert, maybe, or one of those regions where shots come from any direction, and you never know who's friend and who's enemy." A particularly strong thunder made Sargent cower even more. But this time he didn't try to run away. He remained in the same place, as if Michael's voice was an anchor that kept him connected to the present reality. "I was in Africa," said Michael, his voice getting lower. "Peace mission, they said. But there wasn't much peaceful about it. 3 years going back and forth, trying to make a difference in a place where people killed each other for water and food." The rain began to gradually decrease. Michael noticed that Sargent had stopped trembling, although he still maintained the defensive position against the tree. "We lost a lot of good people," he continued. "People who deserved to come home, and those who came back, well, not all of them really managed to come back, if you know what I mean." Sargent raised his head for the first time since Michael had found him. His eyes, although still haunted, seemed more focused. There was something different there. Not exactly recognition, but a primitive connection between two creatures who had gone through similar experiences. "Do you want to try to go home?" asked Michael, slowly extending his hand. "I won't force you into anything, but we don't need to stay here in the rain." Sargent observed the extended hand for several minutes. Slowly, very slowly, he moved toward Michael. He didn't touch his hand, but positioned himself at a distance where he could feel his body heat. The return to the property was made in silence. Sargent walked a few meters behind Michael, stopping whenever he stopped, following whenever he followed. There was no leash, no command. It was a conscious choice to accompany, not trained obedience. Back in the yard, Michael prepared a towel and left it near Sargent's house. The dog approached, sniffed the towel, and surprisingly began to dry himself. These were mechanical movements, but functional. Afterward, for the first time since his arrival, he headed to the food bowls. Michael observed him from his porch drinking hot coffee. Sergeant ate slowly, frequently pausing to check his surroundings, but he ate a significant amount, more than he had consumed in the previous 3 days combined. Progress, murmured Michael to himself. In the following nights, they developed an unspoken routine. Michael would sit on the porch after dinner, and Sergeant would position himself in the yard, always maintaining distance, but always visible. They didn't interact directly, but there was a mutual awareness of each other's presence. 1 week after the storm episode, Michael noticed that Sergeant had moved a few meters closer to the house. Not much, but enough to indicate that his level of distrust was gradually diminishing. It was then that Michael began to notice other details. Sergeant had a peculiar scar behind his left ear. It wasn't the result of a combat injury, but seemed surgical. There was also a discolored spot on his neck, as if something had been removed from his skin. During one afternoon, while Michael worked in the garden, Sergeant approached closer than usual. He remained about 30 feet away, observing Michael dig and plant. His eyes followed each movement, studying the work pattern. "You like to observe," commented Michael without stopping his work. "I bet you were good at your job. Observant, careful, probably saved many lives." Sergeant tilted his head as if processing the words. It was a subtle reaction, but significant. It showed that he was not just listening, but trying to understand. 2 days later, Michael found something that intrigued him. Cleaning Sergeant's house, he discovered that the dog had scratched something into the wood. They weren't random scratches. They formed a specific pattern, as if they were numbers or letters. Michael couldn't decipher what they meant, but he kept the information in mind. In the second week, Sergeant began to show interest in specific sounds. When Michael turned on the radio during work in the garden, the dog would come a little closer. He seemed to have a preference for stations that played classical music or news broadcasts, avoiding stations with very lively music or commercials with sound effects. "You prefer calmer things," observed Michael. "Me too. Too much noise makes me nervous." It was during one of these afternoons of shared work that Michael noticed Sergeant react to a specific word on the radio. The announcer mentioned something about special operations in a report on international politics. Sergeant's ears immediately perked up, and he fixed his gaze in the direction of the radio. "Does that mean something to you?" asked Michael, observing the dog's reaction. Sergeant stood up and walked until he was only about 15 feet from Michael. It was the shortest distance he had maintained since his arrival. His eyes were more alert, more focused, as if something in his memory had been awakened. Michael turned off the radio and sat on the ground, in a less intimidating position. "You worked in special operations," he said, not as a question but as a statement. "They were important missions, weren't they?" Sergeant took a few steps toward Michael. For the first time, he didn't seem to be running away or hiding. He seemed to be approaching by his own choice. "You know," said Michael, keeping his voice low and calm, "I was also part of special operations, things that don't appear in the newspapers, things you can't tell anyone, not even family." Sergeant sat down about 10 feet away. His eyes were fixed on Michael's, and for the first time, there was something beyond emptiness in his gaze. There was curiosity, perhaps even the beginning of recognition. The sun was setting, tinting the sky orange and red. Michael remained seated on the ground, and Sergeant remained in his position. They didn't speak, one because he couldn't, the other because he didn't know what to say, but for the first time since they met, both seemed to be in the same mental space, sharing not just a physical territory, but a tacit understanding that their paths had crossed for a reason they still couldn't name. The third chapter of their coexistence brought discoveries that Michael didn't expect. During an afternoon of more thorough cleaning of the yard, he found something that left him perplexed. Small metallic fragments scattered near the place where Sergeant usually lay. They were tiny pieces, as if something had been torn out or removed in a not very careful way. Michael collected the fragments in a small box and examined them under a magnifying glass. They seemed to be parts of an electronic device, tiny circuits, microscopic wires, components he couldn't identify. His military experience told him they weren't common debris. "Sergeant," he called, observing the dog resting a few meters away. "Where did these pieces come from?" Sergeant raised his head but didn't approach. His eyes, however, fixed on the box Michael was holding, and a subtle change occurred in his posture. His ears perked up and he tilted his head, as if recognizing something familiar. Michael decided to investigate further. That night, while Sergeant slept, he carefully examined the dog with a flashlight. It was then that he discovered something that deeply disturbed him. A small scar on Sergeant's neck, almost imperceptible under the fur, but definitely surgical. "My God," he murmured, kneeling beside the sleeping dog. "What did they do to you?" Sergeant woke up at the touch, but didn't move away. His eyes met Michael's, and there was in them an expression that wasn't fear, but rather a kind of melancholy resignation, as if he knew his secrets were being discovered. Michael ran his finger gently over the scar. "There was something here, wasn't there? Something they took out of you." The next morning, Michael decided to seek help. He knew a retired veterinarian from the armed forces, Dr. Sarah Williams, who had served in international missions and might have knowledge about military procedures on animals. She lived on a neighboring property a few miles away. "Sarah," said Michael on the phone, "I need you to see a dog I adopted. There are some strange things I can't explain." "Sure, Michael, bring him over this afternoon, but tell me what's strange." Michael hesitated. "Surgical scars that don't match combat wounds, and I found metal fragments that seem to be from some electronic device." The silence on the other end of the line extended for a few seconds. "Michael, are you sure you want to get into this? Sometimes it's better to leave certain things in the past." "He deserves for me to understand what happened to him," replied Michael, "just as I would like someone to understand what happened to me." The afternoon at Sarah's property was revealing. She examined Sergeant with professional care, but Michael noticed that her expressions became increasingly somber as the examination progressed. "Michael," she said finally, "this animal was subjected to procedures that, well, aren't exactly orthodox." "What kind of procedures?" Sarah showed the scars on the neck and behind the ear. "Implants, probably monitoring or control devices. See this mark here? It's from a chip much more sophisticated than common identification ones." Michael felt his anger growing. "They used him as a guinea pig?" "Not just as a guinea pig. See these marks on the skull?" Sarah pointed to small, almost invisible scars. "They indicate neurological procedures. They weren't just monitoring his behavior. They were trying to modify it." Sergeant remained quiet during the examination, but Michael noticed that his eyes followed each movement of the veterinarian. There was something in that gaze that suggested the dog understood somehow what was being discussed. "Is there any way to know more about what was done to him?" asked Michael. Sarah hesitated. "I have some contacts who still work in military veterinary research. I can ask some discreet questions." "But Michael, whatever the answer is, it may not be something you want to know." "I need to know," replied Michael firmly. "He deserves justice." 2 days later, Sarah called with information that disturbed Michael. "I managed to talk to a colleague who works at the Department of Veterinary Research of the Armed Forces. He couldn't give details, but he confirmed that there was an experimental program with military dogs between 2019 and 2022. "What kind of program?" "Behavioral modification through neurological implants. The goal was to create animals with absolute obedience and the ability to execute complex missions without direct human supervision." Michael felt nausea growing in his stomach. "They turned dogs into robots." "Something like that. But the program was abruptly terminated after incidents. My contact wouldn't give details, but said some animals developed unexpected behaviors. Resistance to the modifications, perhaps." "And what happened to those animals?" Sarah's silence was eloquent. "Officially, they were removed from service and directed to adoption. Unofficially, they were marked for elimination," completed Michael. "It's possible. My contact mentioned that some dogs disappeared from the records after the program ended, as if they had never existed." Michael hung up the phone with trembling hands. He looked at Sergeant, who was lying in the yard watching the birds in the trees. There was a quiet dignity in his posture that contrasted drastically with the brutality of what he had suffered. "You resisted them, didn't you?" said Michael, approaching the dog. "You refused to become a machine." Sergeant stood up, and for the first time since he arrived, walked directly to Michael. He stopped just a yard away and sat down, his eyes fixed on the man's. "You saved people," continued Michael, as if the pieces of a puzzle were fitting together. "Disobeyed orders to save lives, and for that, they punished you." Sergeant tilted his head, as if confirming Michael's words. It was a subtle reaction, but unequivocal. That night, Michael began to research more deeply into the documents he had received at the auction. Using a magnifying glass and basic knowledge of military codes, he discovered information that had been partially censored, but not completely erased. Sargent's real name was Corporal, and he had served in 3 international missions between 2020 and 2022. There were mentions of irregular behavior and insubordination in the field. But between the lines, they told a different story. An animal that had saved civilian lives by disobeying attack orders. "My God," murmured Michael, reading a partially erased note. "You saved children. You placed yourself between armed soldiers and defenseless civilians." Sargent was lying near the house door, closer than he had ever been. His ears perked up at hearing the emotional tone in Michael's voice. "They called you disobedient," continued Michael, "but you were being human, more human than the humans." It was then that Michael fully understood the extent of what had happened. Sargent wasn't just a traumatized dog. He was a survivor of experiences that violated all principles of dignity and respect. He had resisted attempts to transform him into a programmed weapon, and for that was punished and discarded. "You'll never be discarded again," said Michael, standing up from the table. "I promise." Sargent came even closer, until he was just inches from Michael's feet. Slowly, very slowly, he touched his muzzle to the man's leg. It was the first voluntary physical contact between them. Michael knelt and extended his hand. Sargent sniffed it, hesitated for a moment, and then allowed Michael to touch his head. The contact was brief but meaningful. It was a gesture of trust that transcended words. "We're going to find out who did this to you," said Michael, his voice laden with determination. "And we'll make them answer for it." Sargent lay down at Michael's feet, for the first time since his arrival, assuming a position of complete relaxation. His eyes, although still carrying painful memories, shone with something that didn't exist before: hope. Outside, the wind shook the eucalyptus trees, and the sound was almost musical. Both man and dog remained silent, absorbing the magnitude of what had been discovered and what still needed to be done. The healing journey was just beginning, but for the first time, both knew they weren't alone in it. The night deepened, and for the first time since he arrived, Sargent slept inside the house, lying on the floor next to the armchair where Michael used to spend sleepless nights. It was a small step, but it symbolized a profound transformation. 2 wounded warriors had found in each other not just companionship but renewed purpose. The discoveries about Sargent's past marked the beginning of a new phase in both their lives. Michael dedicated his mornings to researching more information about the military program that had victimized his companion, while Sargent showed increasing signs of emotional recovery. The trust between them solidified day by day, built on the mutual understanding that both had been hurt by systems that had abandoned them. One morning, 3 weeks after Sarah's revelations, Michael received an unexpected call. It was a number he didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end was official, careful. "Mr. Michael Reynolds, this is Lieutenant Colonel Richards from the Department of Veterinary Affairs of the Armed Forces. We've learned that you adopted a dog that may have participated in experimental programs." Michael felt his blood freeze. "How did you know that?" "Sir, we'd like to make a visit to your property. We're interested in evaluating the animal's condition and possibly reintegrating him into more appropriate rehabilitation programs." "Rehabilitation programs or elimination programs," replied Michael, unable to disguise the hostility in his voice. The silence on the other end was revealing. "Mr. Reynolds, it would be better to discuss this in person. We'll be there tomorrow at 2 p.m. Michael hung up the phone with trembling hands. Sargent, who was lying nearby, raised his head, as if sensing the tension in the air. "They want you back," said Michael, kneeling beside the dog. "But they won't take you, not while I'm alive." Sargent approached and for the first time initiated physical contact. He rested his head against Michael's chest, as if offering comfort. It was a deeply human gesture, a demonstration of empathy that transcended species. Michael spent the rest of the day making calls. He contacted Sarah, who offered to be present during the visit. He called a lawyer specialized in animal rights, who explained that the legal situation was complex. Military animals technically belonged to the government, but the procedures Sargent had undergone were questionable from an ethical standpoint. "Michael," said the lawyer, "you need to document everything. Photographs of the scars, the metal fragments you found, testimonials from veterinarians. If we can prove there was abuse, We can argue that the animal was illegally discarded. The next morning, Michael woke up with Sargent lying beside him, something that had never happened before. The dog had spent the entire night close to him, as if he knew something important was about to happen. "You know, don't you?" said Michael, stroking Sargent's head. "You know they're going to try to take you." Sargent looked him in the eyes, and Michael saw a determination there that didn't exist before. It wasn't fear. It wasn't submission. It was resolution. At exactly 2 p.m., 2 military vehicles arrived at the property. Michael and Sarah awaited them on the porch, while Sargent remained in the yard, in a position that allowed him to observe everything without being vulnerable. Lieutenant Colonel Richards was a middle-aged man, with a rigid posture and an indecipherable expression. He was accompanied by a military veterinarian and 2 armed soldiers. "Mr. Reynolds," said Richards, "we appreciate you taking care of the animal, but now we need to take him for proper evaluation." "What kind of evaluation?" intervened Sarah. "I'm a retired military veterinarian, and I can attest that the animal is in perfect health." The military veterinarian approached. "Doctor, with all due respect, this animal underwent specific procedures that require specialized monitoring. It's not appropriate for him to remain in a civilian environment." "Specific procedures," repeated Michael. "You mean torture?" The tension in the air was palpable. Richards maintained a neutral expression, but his eyes betrayed discomfort. "Mr. Reynolds, we won't discuss details of classified operations. The animal must come with us." It was then that something extraordinary happened. Sargent stood up and walked until he was between Michael and the military personnel. His posture wasn't aggressive, but it was definitely protective. His eyes fixed on Richards with an intensity that made the officer take a step back. "Look at that," said Michael. "He's protecting a civilian. Exactly the kind of behavior you tried to erase from him." The military veterinarian made a gesture as if to approach Sargent, but the dog emitted a low growl, not of aggression, but of warning. It was clear that he wouldn't allow them to approach. "This behavior confirms that the animal still presents instability," said Richards. "He needs to be removed immediately." "Actually," said Sarah, taking out a folder of documents, "this behavior confirms that the animal has completely recovered from the traumas you caused." She showed photographs of the scars, veterinary reports, and the metal fragments Michael had found. "We have complete documentation of the illegal procedures to which this animal was subjected. Unauthorized neurological implants, experimental behavioral modifications." "We don't know what you're talking about," replied Richards, but his voice had lost its initial firmness. "Yes, we do," said Michael, showing the partially censored documents. "We know he saved civilian lives by disobeying orders. We know he was punished for having a moral conscience, and we know you tried to transform him into a soulless weapon." Sargent moved even closer to Michael, leaning his body against his leg. It was a gesture of unity, of conscious choice. "He's choosing to stay," said Michael. "For the first time in his life, he has the right to choose. And he chooses to stay with someone who treats him with dignity." Richards observed the scene for long moments. Sargent's posture, the documentation presented, Michael's determination, everything pointed to a situation that could become a scandal if not handled carefully. "Mr. Reynolds," he finally said, "we'll consider this case closed. The animal officially never existed in our records. Therefore, we can't reclaim something that doesn't exist." "Very convenient," replied Michael, "just as it was convenient when he became inconvenient for you." Richards signaled for the soldiers to retreat. "Just ensure that the animal doesn't cause problems. Any incident will be your responsibility." "The only thing he can cause is happiness," said Michael, "something you never allowed him to feel." After the military personnel departed, Michael, Sarah, and Sargent remained in the yard, absorbing the magnitude of what had happened. Sargent had faced his tormentors and chosen his own destiny, not through violence or aggression, but through silent dignity and conscious loyalty. "You know what this means?" said Michael, kneeling beside Sargent. "You're officially free. You can be just a dog if you want, or you can be the hero you've always been." Sargent lay down at Michael's feet, and for the first time since he arrived, his tail wagged slightly. It was a small movement, but it represented an immense transformation. In the months that followed, the lives of both changed completely. Michael began working as a volunteer at a shelter for abandoned animals, using his experience with Sargent to help other traumatized animals. Sargent accompanied him, showing extraordinary patience with younger and frightened dogs. He teaches by example, Michael explained to shelter visitors, shows that it's possible to overcome traumas, that it's possible to trust again. Sargent developed a special relationship with a neighborhood child, Emily, 8 years old, who had lost her father in an accident. She came to visit the property regularly, and Sargent seemed to understand her pain, offering the silent companionship she needed. "He knows what it's like to lose important people," said Michael to the girl's mother, "and he knows how important it is to have someone who understands your pain." One afternoon, 6 months after the military visit, Michael found Sargent playing, really playing, with a ball in the yard. It was something he had never seen before. The dog ran, jumped, showed genuine joy. "You're happy," said Michael, feeling tears in his eyes. "For the first time in your life, you're really happy." Sargent brought the ball to Michael, inviting him to play. It was a simple gesture, but deeply meaningful. It represented not just recovery, but rebirth. That night, as both rested on the porch, Michael reflected on the journey they had shared. Two wounded warriors had found each other at the right time, each offering the other exactly what they needed to heal. "You saved me as much as I saved you," said Michael, stroking Sargent's head. "You showed me that it's still worth fighting for what's right." Sargent looked at him with eyes that were no longer empty, but full of life, gratitude, and something that could only be described as pure love. His scars were still visible, but now they told a story of survival and triumph, not defeat. The night sky stretched above them, filled with stars that seemed to silently witness the transformation of two souls who had found peace in each other. The darkness that once consumed them had given way to a quiet light, sustained by the certainty that, no matter how deep the wounds, it's always possible to find healing when you have company on the journey. Sargent rested his head on Michael's chest, and both remained like that. Two survivors who had learned that true victory isn't in winning battles, but in preserving humanity, even in the face of the worst circumstances. Their scars were now medals of honor, reminders that they had resisted, survived, and most importantly, never lost the capacity to love and be loved. Dear listeners, we hope that Michael and Sargent's story has deeply touched your hearts. This journey of healing and redemption reminds us that we all deserve a second chance, that dignity can be restored even after the deepest traumas. To continue following equally moving stories that explore the complexity of life and the extraordinary connections between beings who find each other at the right moment, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave your like on this video. Your stories of overcoming and hope inspire us to bring more and more content that celebrates the strength of the human and animal spirit. Share in the comments your own experiences with special animals. Each story is unique and deserves to be told. Until the next emotional journey.